Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be reading and discussing Part 3, Chapters 11 through 15 of the Diana Paul translation of the Śrīmālādevī Siṃhanāda Sūtra. The title of this sutra translates to Discourse on the Lion's Roar of Queen Śrīmālā, and it primarily centers on explaining emptiness or shunyata through the lens of Buddha-nature discourse. This section of the sutra, in particular chapters 13 and 14, actually proved to be quite controversial, and our discussion today will mainly center around those two. That is not to say that there's not interesting things going on in the other chapters. It's just to say that the most controversial claims, or otherwise the claims that docs and I are inclined to examine and challenge, occur mostly in those two chapters. Before we get into it, I highly recommend that you listen to parts 1 and 2, chapters 1 through 10, of this sutra reading and discussion, before you listen to this one. We hope you enjoy. Chapter 11. The One Refuge. The one noble truth, namely the extinction of suffering, is separate from the conditioned. What is separate from the conditioned is permanent. What is permanent is not false and deceptive in nature. What is not false and deceptive in nature is true, permanent, and a refuge. Therefore, the noble truth of the extinction of suffering is the supreme truth. Chapter 12. The Contrary Truths. The noble truth of the extinction of suffering is inconceivable, transcending all the conditions of the consciousness of living beings. This is also not the knowledge of Arhats and Pratyekabuddhas, who, like those born blind, cannot see all shapes, or like a week-old infant who cannot see the disk of the moon. The truth of the extinction of suffering, similarly, does not belong to the condition of the common person's consciousness, nor to the two vehicles' realm of knowledge. The common person's consciousness refers to the two contrary views. The wisdom of all Arhats and Pratyekabuddhas is pure in comparison with that of the common person. Limited views refer to the common person's adherence to the misconception that there is a substantial ego within the 5 psychophysical elements, or skandhas, which then causes the two views that are designated contrary, namely eternalism and nihilism. If one considers the conditioned states impermanent, this is nihilism and not the correct view. If one considers nirvana permanent, this is eternalism and not the correct view. Because of misconceptions, there are such views. In the sense organs of the body, which are discriminative in nature, some perceive the destruction of phenomena in the present moment. Unable to see phenomena in continuity, they become nihilistic in their views because of misconceptions. The ignorant, who are unable to understand or know the momentary consciousness with reference to its continuity, become eternalistic in their views because of misconceptions. By this or that principle, they discriminate and maintain inadequate positions to an extreme degree. Because of foolish misconceptions, they adhere to erroneous conceptions and contrary views, namely nihilism and eternalism. O Lord, living beings have contrary ideas when they have acquired the 5 psychophysical elements of the individual. The impermanent is considered permanent. Suffering is considered happiness. The non-substantiality of the self is considered a substantial self. The impure is considered pure. The knowledge of all Arhats and Pratyekabuddhas has not originally apprehended the Dharma body of the Tathagata, nor the realm of his omniscience. If there are living beings who believe in the Buddha's words, they will have thoughts of permanence, of happiness, of self, and of purity. These are not contrary views, but are correct views. Why? The Dharma body of the Tathagata is the perfection of permanence, the perfection of happiness, the perfection of the substantial self, and the perfection of purity. Those who see the Dharma body of the Buddha in this way are said to see correctly. Those who see correctly are the true sons and daughters of the Buddha. They arise from the Buddha's words, from the true Dharma, and from conversion to the Dharma, attaining the remaining benefits of the Dharma. O Lord, pure wisdom is the perfection of wisdom that belongs to all Arhats and Pratyekabuddhas. This pure wisdom, although it is called pure wisdom, with reference to the conditioned noble truth of the extinction of suffering, is not the realm of unconditioned wisdom. Of course, the wisdom of those beginning to study the Four Basic Truths, i.e. the Four Noble Truths, also does not belong to the realm of unconditioned wisdom. Why? The three vehicles' first actions were not ignorant of the Dharma. Because of their principles, they understood and attained enlightenment. The Buddha explained the Four Basic Truths for their sake. O Lord, these Four Basic Truths are the Dharma of the world. O Lord, the one refuge is all refuges. It is the transcendental and supreme refuge, namely the truth of the extinction of suffering. Chapter 13. The Inherently Pure. O Lord, the cycle of birth and death depends on the Tathagatagarbha, because the Tathagatagarbha is referred to as the original limit of the cycle of birth and death, which is unknowable. O Lord, Tathagatagarbha is referred to as the cycle of birth and death for a proper designation. O Lord, the cycle of birth and death is the extinction of the senses and the subsequent arising of new inexperienced senses. This is called the cycle of birth and death. O Lord, these two phenomena, birth and death, are the Tathagatagarbha. It is worldly convention to say there is birth and there is death. Death is the extinction of one's senses. Birth is the arising of new senses. The Tathagatagarbha is neither life nor death. The Tathagatagarbha is separate from the conditioned. The Tathagatagarbha is eternal and unchanging. Therefore, the Tathagatagarbha is the basis, the support, and the foundation. O Lord, the Tathagatagarbha is not separate, not severed, not liberated from, and not different from the inconceivable Buddha Dharmas. O Lord, the basis, support, and foundation of conditioned phenomena, which are severed from, separate from, and different from the Buddha Dharmas, also are the Tathagatagarbha. O Lord, if there were no Tathagatagarbha, there would be no revulsion towards suffering, nor aspiration to seek nirvana. Why? Because the seven mental phenomena, the six sense consciousnesses, and the knowledge of their accompanying mental phenomena do not continue even momentarily, and do not accept the impressions of suffering. There cannot be revulsion for suffering, nor aspiration to seek nirvana. The Tathagatagarbha is without any prior limit, is non-arising, and is indestructible, accepting suffering, having revulsion towards suffering, and aspiring to nirvana. O Lord, the Tathagatagarbha is not a substantial self, nor a living being, nor fate, nor a person. The Tathagatagarbha is not a realm for living beings who have degenerated into the belief of a substantially existent body, or for those who have contrary views, or who have minds bewildered by emptiness. O Lord, the Tathagatagarbha is the womb of the Dharmas, the womb of the Dharma body, the transcendental womb, and the inherently pure womb. This Tathagatagarbha that is inherently pure is the inconceivable realm of the Tathagata that has been contaminated by extrinsic defilements and other virulent defilements. Why? The good mind is momentary and not contaminated by defilements. The evil mind is also momentary, but is not contaminated by defilements either. Defilements do not affect the mind. The mind does not affect defilements. Then how does the mind, which is unaffected by nature, become defiled? O Lord, there are defilements and there are defiled minds. The fact that there is defilement in a mind that is inherently pure is difficult to comprehend. Only the Buddhas, the Lords, who have the eye of truth and the wisdom of truth, who are the sources of the Dharma and penetrate the Dharma, and who are the refuge of the true Dharma, can comprehend this truth. When Queen Śrīmālā had explained the difficulties in comprehending the inherently pure mind's defilement, she was questioned by the Buddha. The Buddha, with extreme joy, praised her. Yes, it is so, it is so. The fact that there is defilement in a mind that is inherently pure is difficult to comprehend. There are two subjects that are difficult to completely comprehend. They are the mind that is inherently pure and the fact that this same mind has been contaminated by defilements. These two subjects can be heard by you and the Bodhisattva Mahasattvas who have the great Dharma. The others, namely the disciples, can only believe through the Buddha's words. Chapter 14. the true sons and daughters of the Tathagata. The Buddha said, "If my disciples comply with their early stages of faith and subsequent, more fervent faith, then they will attain the ultimate after completing their subsequent wisdom of the Dharma that is based upon the illumination of faith. The subsequent wisdom of the Dharma is the insight and fundamental investigation into the realms of sensation and consciousness, insight into karmic retribution, insight into the eye of the Arhat, insight into the happiness of the autonomy of mind and into the happiness of meditation, and insight into the supernatural powers of the Arhats, Pratyekabuddhas, and powerful Bodhisattvas. When these 5 kinds of insight have been completed, even after my final nirvana, in future generations, my disciples who have the early stages of faith, the subsequent more fervent faith, and the subsequent wisdom of the Dharma that is based upon the illumination of faith will attain the ultimate, even though their inherently pure minds become contaminated by defilements. The ultimate is the cause for entering the path of the Mahayana. Faith in the Tathagata has great benefits. Do not slander my Dharma's profound meaning." Then Queen Śrīmālā said to the Buddha, "There are still remaining great benefits which I will explain, with the Buddha's permission." The Buddha said, "Again, please explain." Queen Śrīmālā said to the Buddha, "The 3 kinds of good sons and daughters who, within the most profound meaning of the Dharma, have separated themselves from injury to the Dharma, produce great merits, entering the path of the Mahayana. What are the 3 kinds of good sons and daughters? They are those good sons and daughters who develop their own wisdom of the most profound Dharma, develop the subsequent wisdom of the Dharma that is based upon the illumination of faith, and revere the Lord though they do not completely understand the most profound Dharma. What is known only by the Buddhas is not our realm. These above mentioned are called the good sons and daughters who revere the Tathagata. Only these are the good sons and daughters." Chapter 15. Śrīmālā. Śrīmālā said, "All the remaining living beings who stubbornly cling to false teachings, instead of to the most profound Dharma, turn their backs to the true Dharma and habitually practice the corrupt ways of various heterodoxies. These corrupt ways must be subdued by the Dharma King's powers and by the powers of the divine Nagas." When Queen Śrīmālā and her attendants paid obeisance to the Buddha said, "Excellent, excellent Queen Śrīmālā. In the most profound Dharma protected by skillful means, subdue what is not the Dharma. Maintain well its correctness. You have already been very close to the hundreds of millions of Buddhas and can explain this Dharma's meaning." At that time, the Lord emitted a most excellent light, radiating everywhere over the assembly. His body ascended into the sky, higher than 7 tala trees. Walking in the sky, he returned to the kingdom of Sravasti. Then Queen Śrīmālā and her attendants together faced the Buddha and were transfixed by the sight of him, not moving for even a moment. The Buddha, having passed through their field of vision, caused them to be exalted. Each individual praised the Tathagata's merits and was mindful of him. The Buddha then re-entered the city. Turning toward her husband, King Mitrayasas, Queen Śrīmālā praised the Mahayana. All the women of the city, 7 years of age and older, were converted to the Mahayana. King Mitrayasas was also converted to the Mahayana. All the men, 7 years of age and older, were converted to the Mahayana. Then all the citizens of the state were turned toward the Mahayana. Then the Lord entered the Jeta garden, spoke to the Venerable Ananda, and called upon Shakra, the king of heaven. Shakra, along with his retinue, immediately arrived in the presence of the Buddha. Then the Lord turned toward the king of heaven, Shakra, and to the Venerable Ananda, and extensively explained this text. Having explained it, he said to Lord Shakra, "You should accept and read this sutra, O Kaushika. Good sons and daughters, in innumerable kalpas, as numerous as the sands of the Ganges River, cultivate the practice of enlightenment and practice the 6 perfections. If these good sons and daughters learn and read this sutra and uphold it, their blessings will be immense. How much more advantageous will it be for those who explain this text? O Kaushika, you must read this sutra on behalf of the 33 heavens, defining and extensively explaining it." Then the Buddha said to Ananda, You must also accept and read this sutra. For the sake of the 4 groups of followers, you must extensively explain this sutra." Then the King of Heaven, Shakra, asked the Buddha, "O Lord, what is the name of this sutra? How does one adhere to its teaching?" The Buddha said to Lord Shakra, "This sutra has immeasurable and limitless merits. All the disciples and Buddhas cannot ultimately have insight into these merits nor know them. Kaushika, you should know all the great merits that are so subtle and profound in this sutra. Now I shall, on your behalf, briefly explain its name. Listen well and remember this text." Then the King of Heaven Shakra and the Venerable Ananda said to the Buddha, "Excellent, O Lord. Yes, we will do as you have instructed." The Buddha said, "This sutra praises the supreme merits of the true Dharma and the Tathagata in Chapter 1. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 2 the 10 inconceivable ordination vows. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 3 the great aspiration that embraces all aspirations. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 4 the inconceivable acceptance of the true Dharma. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 5 the entrance into the one vehicle. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 6 the unlimited noble truths. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 7 the Tathagatagarbha. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 8 the Dharma body. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 9 the underlying truth, the meaning of emptiness. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 10 the one noble truth. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 11 the one refuge that is eternal and quiescent. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 12 the contrary truths. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 13 the inherently pure mind that is covered by defilements. In this manner, accept it. It explains in Chapter 14 the true sons and daughters of the Tathagata. In this manner, accept it. Teach the Sutra of Queen Śrīmālā of the Lion's Roar. In this manner, accept it. Again, O Kaushika, the explanations of this sutra eliminate all doubts. Be steadfast in the complete meaning of this text and enter the path of the one vehicle. O Kaushika, today this scripture, the Sutra of Queen Śrīmālā of the Lion's Roar, has been transmitted to you. As long as the Dharma continues, accept, read, extensively define, and explain this sutra." Lord Shakra said to the Buddha, "Very well, O Lord, we will reverently receive your holy teaching." Then the King of Heaven, Shakra, the Venerable Ananda, and the great assemblies of gods, asuras, and Gandharvas, among others, heard the Buddha's teaching and joyfully put it into practice. Thus concludes the Śrīmālādevī Siṃhanāda Sūtra. So that was chapters 11 through 15 of the Śrīmālādevī Siṃhanāda Sūtra. Docs, what did you think?
I had an extremely strong reaction to this section of reading, probably the strongest reaction to any of the sutras we've read on the show so far. And spoiler alert, it was not a positive reaction. Chapter 13 made me so angry I had to stop and come back to finish the reading later after cooling off a bit. I reject this real hard.
Yeah, it has some controversial claims in it, and I think that the translation and the intertextuality have contributed to making this one potentially, you might say, an inimical text. So I think it would be good to go ahead and get right into it, start going chapter by chapter, and really dig into the meat of what we are reacting to. So chapter 11, I see here you don't have very much to say about it. Is there anything that you'd like to mention?
I mean, it's a paragraph long, and it's just setting up some fairly esoteric distinctions between a couple of words. Like, nothing much to say here, really.
I agree. I think that it is as straightforward / as esoteric as it's going to be, and I think that it's best to just kind of let the words wash over you, and they serve as context and dressing for the rest of the text as well. Chapter 12.
So, the two pieces here that most stood out to me is talking about eternalism versus nihilism, and adding a distinction between pure wisdom and unconditioned wisdom. Let's start with eternalism versus nihilism. So, we've discussed this a bit between recordings to add some clarification for my own benefit, but nihilism, I would guess, is more or less the same thing that we in the West in the modern day would understand nihilism to be, correct?
Somewhat. So this distinction, eternalism versus nihilism, these are English translations for schools of philosophical thought existing in India around the time of the life of the Buddha, and they do refer to specific strains of what could fall under the umbrella of Vedic thought. Nihilism, to give one kind of specific piece of what it means in that context, it is the idea that all sentient beings have a self, a capital S self. We might think of it as like a soul. And in nihilism, when a sentient being dies, that self or that soul is destroyed. It dissolves. It's gone forever. So sentient life is just a spark that is born and then dies. And it doesn't exist in any other way outside of that. And for that reason, they discount a lot of the fundamental assumptions of reincarnation. They discount a lot of the fundamental assumptions around emptiness as well. They buy into impermanence, but like I say, they have this very specific idea of the presence of a self or a soul that just comes and goes. Eternalism is a school of thought that, in the context of the self or the soul, Atman, they believe that the self or the soul persists for all eternity through reincarnations and is fundamentally unchanged for all eternity. And in that sense, they believe that the past, present, and future of that self or soul or Atman is eternally, constantly co-present. So there's this idea that the succession of time is kind of like an illusory experience that we have to rise above, or a delusion that we have to get rid of and start feeling everything everywhere all at once, so to speak. And that's just in regards to the Atman, those two, right? There's many more kind of doctrinal points that they each hold together, but it's all on this theme of this temporary coming and going for nihilism, or this eternal, constant co-presence with eternalism. And it's important to remember, too, that they exist under the umbrella of Vedic philosophy. So they're all engaging with the concept of Atman, the concept of samsara, and nirvana, or otherwise moksha, which we've said is liberation from samsara, in a different context than nirvana, right? It's kind of like the Hindu version of nirvana with some pretty fundamental differences, but still is kind of an escape or an afterlife. So all that to say, like, they're engaging with impermanence, they're engaging with Atman, emptiness, they're engaging with reincarnation, they're engaging with karma, all of that good stuff in the same ways that they do. And we have seen a little bit of the Buddha's discussions on eternalism and nihilism in other places. We read a sutra where, for example, the Buddha discounted 6 different kinds of non-Buddhist philosophies or ways of thinking or ways of practice. That was one that engaged with atomism, eternalism, nihilism, if you remember.
Yeah, I remember that one.
It comes up in a few different places, but that's sort of the distinction between the two here. And then we'll get into the connection with nirvana in a second. But what do you think about that sort of piece there?
I think that translating those to eternalism and nihilism for the purpose of this sutra is probably accurate enough. The big difference is whether the self stops existing after death or is always existing and has always existed and will always exist in a relatively unchanging form. Those are the core differences that this text seems to be engaging with. So there's no way to translate those ideas into one word in a different language. It requires a lot more context to get the full picture, but it is full enough to engage with the ideas in this sutra, I think.
I kind of think so too, as long as it comes with the context that this is like specifically Vedic nihilism, Vedic eternalism. Western nihilism has turned into more than just that and is an entirely different context than just that, right? I would say that nihilism has a very specific moral philosophy or behavioral philosophy in the West in the modern times that's specific to this like post-Christian context and this postmodern context as well, right? But then eternalism and nihilism in the context of this sutra and in Indian philosophy, it lacks that context and it has entirely different moral and behavioral implications that the Buddha has addressed sometimes in broad strokes, sometimes in very straw man fashions, I think, but still otherwise has spoken on a little bit.
Yeah, it's something that could be clarified with a quick footnote in the text, probably.
Exactly.
So let's talk a bit about a distinction between pure wisdom and unconditioned wisdom.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. So when people come to the study of Buddhism, they may know or have at least like an unconscious familiarity with ideas of purity and impurity in a religious context. In almost 100% of cases, purity and impurity refers to something morally charged in a religious or philosophical tradition. That which is impure is behaviors or states of beings or whatever kind of state or function is decided upon as being bad. And then pure is that which is decided upon as being good, right? People don't really in the West think that Buddhism has pure and impure for the most part. Like that's something that people have to learn. And we've dealt with it a lot on the show before when we've talked about Buddhist morality and stuff and Buddhist ethics. But I just want to kind of speak to that part. Like pure and impure is kind of an unfamiliar thing for a lot of Westerners with regards to Buddhism. It does here again refer specifically to moral stuff. So pure wisdom is morally good knowledge, morally good beliefs, morally good wisdom. We can think of wisdom as a set of knowledge or a set of experience that governs behaviors and governs how and whether or not you seek out new knowledge and new experience and how you decide what experience and knowledge you seek out, right? Wisdom is kind of like guiding principles, guiding knowledge, guiding experience. And in the context of Buddhism, that purity is attached to this whenever all of that is in a morally good cycle. So pure wisdom is insight into what is good and what is bad, and letting that kind of drive the bus with regards to seeking what is good and avoiding what is bad. Unconditioned is an interesting adjective to attach to anything in Buddhism. And we're going to spend a lot of our time today talking about this term. In Buddhism, we've talked about the kind of philosophy of causality that's laid out. In a world that is marked by impermanence and emptiness, that which occurs, arises, presents itself, manifests, only does so due to causes and conditions specifically. That means that everything is conditioned in our everyday mundane reality. And then somewhat later in Buddhism, this idea of that which is unconditioned becomes laid out. And it's a really interesting response to conditionality. I thought that early Buddhism's description of causes and conditions and causality was really just to establish the truth of impermanence and emptiness in the broadest and most simple possible way. But then it got really deeply examined, and thinkers started to ask what is unconditioned, what is not subject to impermanence. One of the things they found was not subject to impermanence and emptiness. Some people decided was the Dharma. The Dharma itself is not impermanent. Emptiness is not itself empty, because these are not part of the conversation. We can go and say objects in space are conditioned because they are made and then they exist and then they kind of disintegrate and change states over time. We can say that sentient beings are conditioned, right, for the same reason. We can say all kinds of things are conditioned, but the fundamental source code of reality, which is Dharma, according to Buddhism, that cannot be conditioned because that is unchanging. Also, it's not subject to itself. Source code is not subject to itself, if that makes sense, in this kind of philosophy here. So unconditioned wisdom is arguing in those two words alone that all sentient beings have in them the potential to access the wisdom of Buddhahood, the wisdom of emptiness, of suchness, of Buddha nature. And we've talked about lots and lots and lots how in this sutra and in Mahayana in general, the Dharma, Buddhahood, Buddha nature, emptiness, suchness, these things are all being collapsed into being the same thing, different words referring to the same thing. So unconditioned wisdom is not separate from, mutually exclusive from pure wisdom. Unconditioned wisdom is just simply that which is dharmic, not karmic in a good or bad way. Karmic wisdom is pure or impure. Dharmic wisdom is unconditioned. I hope that makes sense.
It does to me, and we've mentioned in previous episodes on this sutra that this feels less insulting to previous traditions. And with that distinction and the way the terms are used in these chapters, that praise falls away a bit, because claiming that previous traditions had no access to unconditioned wisdom is, observably false. The previous traditions had understanding of impermanence, of emptiness, of what karma is and isn't. That is in the previous writings. That is something that the previous traditions spent a lot of time and effort talking about. It was there. And now in this chapter 12, it's like the Arhats and Pratyekabuddhas had pure wisdom, but we have unconditioned wisdom. That's not at all exclusive to this tradition in a way that I find quite denigrating and dismissive of previous traditions.
I agree that it is denigrating of previous traditions, but I should note that impermanence and emptiness and karma, those still fall under pure or impure wisdom. And I should have mentioned what is defined as unconditioned wisdom in this sutra specifically is Tathagatagarbha, Buddha nature. And looking at the previous texts, it's still denigrating to me because Tathagatagarbha to me is an intellectual kind of advancement that occurs. It's not that earlier texts in history knew about it and discounted it, or that they knew about it, were thinking about it, and rejected it. Nobody actually came up with the idea until historically later, when Mahayana was already catching on. And so it's kind of like looking back at people who lived in 1600 and saying they rejected electricity, therefore they are lesser than us, right? So that's an unfair thing to say. And it's unfair for the sutra to look back and say that Buddha nature philosophy doesn't come up in the Pali Canon, therefore the Pali Canon is all stupid. It's saying that in a much more verbose and maybe less mean way, but still, at the end of the day, that's kind of what is going on here. And that's what we see a lot in Mahayana. And that's why we kind of have our feelings that we have about the interdenominational sniping, is because it's like, you're not giving them the benefit of the doubt, and you're not giving them the benefit of engaging with the same materials that you are at the same time. Do you know what I mean? So that's an important distinction to have there.
To me, it seems more like they're not giving credit for setting the foundations that they build Tathagatagarbha philosophy on.
Exactly.
It's looking at your roots and going, no, this is no good. They don't have it. But they do. And if they didn't, you wouldn't have it now.
Exactly, yeah.
They might not have the same thing. They might not have as much. But where this sutra comes from owes tremendously to the same traditions that it is dismissing here. And that is at best ungrateful and rude.
Yeah, and that can be applied to any of the interdenominational sniping we see in any Mahayana sutra that we have ever encountered, right? It is not giving due credit. And I think that it's misrepresenting the work also in a lot of ways. We've talked about that in many contexts. I think that there are some things that Mahayana brings to the table that I agree with more than the Pali Canon in some cases, but I still don't think that just because of that, that means that the Pali Canon didn't contribute significantly and that the older stuff didn't lay the groundwork, like you say, and that they were doing something wrong. Because I, personally, speaking just for me, myself, I actually do agree with and believe in this idea of Buddha nature, for example. I think that that kind of just refers to the fact that every sentient being has the potential to do great good. And I don't think that the authors of the Pali Canon just outright reject that fact at all.
Yeah, I mean, we're about to get into it, but I don't see Buddha nature in that perspective. So we've kind of already gone over this to a point where we can move on. What's happening here isn't as directly insulting as what we've seen in previous sutras, but it's still ultimately the same thing. And I find that distasteful.
Totally.
And then we get to chapter 13, and this is where I flip the table. So, a common thing going through this is talking about previous ideas of nirvana as being eternalistic, and then talking about the Tathagatagarbha as something that is eternal, but I don't see how Tathagatagarbha, as it is presented here, is distinct from older ideas of nirvana in a way that changes that accusation. It seems like Tathagatagarbha here is as eternalistic as previous ideas of nirvana.
I totally see what you mean, yeah. So, not to defend the text, but I do definitely want to give some context.
I would also say it's perfectly fine to defend the text here, because I'm about to attack it. It needs someone to defend it.
Oh yeah, totally. Well, like I'm not going to die on the hill of the Śrīmālādevī Sutra, but I will definitely give as much information and context as I have for some of the claims that it's making and try to explain them in the context that I know that it exists in. And if that still doesn't work, then that's kind of where I would lay down arms and say, like, yeah, you don't agree with it and that's fine. So let's go down that path a little bit. So whenever it says that the older ideas of nirvana are eternalistic, it's referring to this, like, maybe you would call it Vedic or like immediately post-Vedic kind of conception of the Buddhist cosmology. So if you're like a Westerner and you're sitting in your very first world religions class and your teacher is not a scholar of Buddhism, one of the ways that they may have presented your Buddhism unit, you know, especially like decades ago, like older kind of classes, right? They would say that like samsara is like everyday life and nirvana is the afterlife. And nirvana is like heaven in the Christian context or something like that. And that claim is, you know, entirely false, especially when it's applied to the totality of Buddhism. But the theme of that idea may have some accuracy to it when we talk about like the earliest conceptions of samsara and nirvana. So in early Buddhism, the idea was that we are doing all this work to become arhats, to become enlightened, so that we stop the cycle of birth and death in samsara, because that cycle is illusory, it's agonizing and painful. There's a lot of suffering and desire in it. There's also dukkha in general, not just painful, agonizing suffering, but also dukkha. And it's just ultimately spinning our wheels. And so we exert all this effort, we study, we meditate, we perfect ourselves morally, and ideally that will snuff us out of samsara. And we can achieve sort of eternal lack of existence in nirvana. And what I mean by existence is lack of arising in samsara. So just starting right there, the claim that earlier Buddhism is looking at nirvana eternalistically is a bit unfounded. Okay, just on that point alone. This is very common in Mahayana texts. They are always looking back at the Pali Canon and they are saying that the arhats are trying to achieve like eternal afterlife in nirvana, and that's why they are misguided. And that's not actually the truth. That's not actually how it's presented in the Pali Canon, and that's not actually how it's presented and practiced and understood in early Buddhism and in Theravada Buddhism. So, let's just lay that right there. This is already a problematic claim to make. Nevertheless, they're making it, and they're saying that the conception of nirvana that I just presented from earlier Buddhism, whether it's eternalistic or not, is wrong. And instead, it's being substituted for a newer Mahayana definition of nirvana, which has it as not a place that you go over there. It's not the far shore. We're not on this shore crossing over the sea of birth and death over to the far shore. Instead, rather than being a state of being, and rather than being a destination, cosmologically or physically, nirvana is a fundamental truth. And again, I've said this before, when we say truth, that's almost an incomplete way to diagnose how it's understood in Buddhism, because truth is dualistic with untruth and non-truth. Truth is something that can be challenged and assailed and argued against and put down in its own way. It's a fundamental principle or characteristic of the Dharma, of reality, of everything. And so in that way, instead of looking at it as A and B, as two distinct, mutually exclusive, almost non-interacting entities, nirvana should be thought of as samsara and samsara as nirvana. And you achieve kind of this non-dualistic way of understanding it. And when you remove this idea of nirvana as a state of being or as a physical or cosmological destination, then Mahayana argues, and this sutra argues, only then are you actually practicing correctly. And it's hazy. It's so hazy and nebulous. Nirvana is described in the earlier texts as being marked by bliss and by equanimity and all of these states of being that sound like a paradise, that sound like heaven. And again, in the Mahayana texts, it's being described in very similar ways. But ultimately, the truth of it being a snuffing out, or the truth of it being the discontinued arising in samsara, remains through all of these. So that's the idea there. It's a bad claim to make to say that the older view is eternalistic. It's a false claim because that's not how it's presented. But that's the context for what idea of nirvana are we talking about if we're saying that this old one is wrong.
Maybe it's in other sutras that are supposed to be in parallel to this one, but this sutra does not give a good enough view of how this view of nirvana is distinct from previous views. Enough to, this feels like the pot calling the kettle black. I don't see the distinction between what is being presented here through the Tathagatagarbha from the idea of nirvana that it's criticizing. So the claim falls flat for me because I don't see the distinction. And I was arguing, about things being dualistic or non-dualistic earlier. That distinction is a dualistic distinction, but it is a dualistic distinction that is coming from the sutra.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's coming from the sutra really hard. So if you are making that distinction, sutra, please help me make that distinction with you. And what I found constantly frustrating with this was when I'm asking for that distinction to be made, the sutra goes, what is unconditioned is extremely difficult to understand. Those without the insight cannot understand it, and just doesn't even try to explain. And that kind of rhetoric just pisses me off real bad.
Definitely, yeah. And this isn't the only text where we are kind of told to have faith or to make that kind of leap of faith ideologically. The awakening of faith in the Mahayana, people will claim day and night that text doesn't argue in favor of blind faith, but there are a few jumps where it has to rely on blind faith in a lot of ways. And those jumps are not, I would say, impactful in the way that a lot of other blind faith could be. It's on small things, but at the same time, it's still there. And so we can't pretend like it's not. if I had to kind of boil it down, I would say that like when they're talking about Tathagatagarbha as unconditioned, eternal, unchanging, I almost think of it like we have the three Dharma seals, emptiness, impermanence, and dukkha. And Mahayana and this text are trying to say, here's a fourth, Buddha nature, right? All of the Tathagatagarbha sutras are doing that. They're kind of establishing Buddha nature, Tathagatagarbha, as this, I don't know, this previously unseen or unheard of fourth secret Dharma seal. So in that regard, just like emptiness, impermanence, dukkha, it is not subject to emptiness, impermanence, and dukkha. It's itself a line of the source programming for reality. And so what's weird to me in this chapter, and I see again probably was weird to you as well, is like, first off, why are we even having a conversation about nirvana together with Tathagatagarbha, right? Like that's already two separate distinct ideas. And we can try and relate them in terms of their conditioned or unconditionedness, or their eternalism or nihilism or whatever. We could try to relate them in those kinds of thematic ways. But ultimately, these are two very distinct ideas that, and the way that they relate to each other later on is that you can't achieve a perfect level of nirvana without accepting Tathagatagarbha, which, again, stuff we've seen many times. And the Lotus Sutra, all it ever says is you can't achieve Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi, or like perfect Buddhahood, unless you accept the Lotus Sutra. All Mahayana sutras make that kind of claim. So what's the conversation here adding to that kind of discourse? For me, not much.
Same here. And like that's definitely, there's multiple times where I was looking at this and going, why are we even talking about this? Like, what use is this? And it seems like a matter of, like you said, you have to accept it in order to achieve maximum enlightenment. But why? And it feels like every time I come to that question of why, the answer this sutra gave is it's too hard for people to understand.
Yeah, a possible sort of like tinfoil hat theory about this could be also that when it comes to these concepts that could even potentially rely on faith, on Shraddha, as it's defined in Buddhism, as we've discussed it before on the show. When it comes to those factors, they could be taking the explanation out of Śrīmālādevī's mouth because she's a woman. So the idea could be that the ideas they're putting into her voice are more suited to an idealized version of a woman's practice or a woman's thought process in Buddhism.
I feel like I've seen that in the mouths of men in previous readings as well. So making it a gendered thing is a step further than I would go. But there is definitely a distinction between everyday person thinking versus super advanced bodhisattva level thinking that comes up as kind of a everything proof shield against questions of why.
Definitely, yeah. Definitely. Well, it becomes circular too.
Yeah.
We talked about it a lot in the Lotus Sutra. It's circular because like it's saying if you don't believe in the text of the Lotus Sutra, you won't achieve perfect Buddhahood. And you have to believe in the text of it to achieve perfect Buddhahood. And if you don't, then you won't. It just goes back and forth like that. And there's no concrete cosmological technical explanation ever for why. And nobody's ever actually figured out why. People just believe it or they don't.
So let's move forward to the line that most badly, like I was already turning against this sutra quite badly in chapter 13. And then we get to this line, and I'm clipping out a portion in the middle of this line that's extra detailed that is there for the structure of the sutra more than the meaning, I think. So the line is, quote, "O Lord, if there were no Tathagatagarbha, there would be no revulsion towards suffering, nor aspiration to seek nirvana. Why? Because the 7 mental phenomena, snip a bit, do not continue even momentarily, and do not accept the impressions of suffering. There cannot be revulsion for suffering, nor aspiration to seek nirvana. So, breaking that down. First off, continue even momentarily. So, in the mind-bending timescales that Buddhism operates on, it's going to seem like the span of a given mind, a given life, is so small that it is practically zero. And when we do these kinds of analyses in our modern times, when an astronomer is measuring the distance between stars, the difference of 1,000,000 miles is so small compared to the distance that is being measured that it often gets glossed over as being unimportant. And in order to do this kind of analysis with the tools we have to do that. But we're talking about an enlightened frame of mind, which means an omniscient frame of mind, which means a mind that is able to look into that level of detail. We had the sutra we discussed however long ago where the Buddha was just doubling things over and over again until he gets to numbers that we do not have words for. Like, we can't zoom in that precisely, but a Buddha can. And with that level of detail and access, 70 whatever years of life that you're going to get in a human, the 70 to 100 years, it's still short in the Buddhist time scale, but it's not even a moment. The mind does exist more than momentarily. It's not just a spark done kind of deal. And so I don't think that argument holds water. Secondly, there is the claim that the mind does not accept impressions of suffering. And but they do, though. We can see dukkha. We can see impermanence. I did not need the Buddha to tell me that impermanence is a thing. I observed it before I even started examining Buddhism. I observed a level of dissatisfaction with life before I started observing Buddhism. And so, the mind can observe those things. It can accept those impressions. Now, studying Buddhism has definitely refined my ideas about what this dissatisfaction is. I've learned new things from it, and those things do fit into the framework that I have been building before, but here it seems like the sutra is claiming that doesn't happen when we've observed that it does. So, the claims in that paragraph just falls flat from basic observing what the world works like and the way people work. And it feels like that sucks real bad.
I'm with you, yeah. So, again, to add context, let me give the 7 mental factors. I think that's an important piece of context to agree with or disagree with this claim that the sutra is making. So, I don't know if we've ever talked about this on the show before, but the 7 mental factors are phassa, which translates to contact, vedana, which is feeling, sanya, which is perception, cetana, which is volition, ekaggata, which is one-pointedness, or it's also called samadhi. The next one is jivitendriya, which is the faculty of being alive, life faculty, and manasikara, attention. Okay, so these are all, you might say, characteristics, elements, components of mental activity as it is defined in Buddhism. We talked about the 5 aggregates or the 5 skandhas before. We have form, sensation, feeling, mental activity. I forget the rest. It doesn't matter. The 7 mental factors are part of this 5 skandhas scheme. So form is engaged with consciousness through contact, phassa. And contact leads to perception, sanna. Okay, and vedana is feeling, which is kind of like a judgment on if that perception is good or bad. mental formations are, you could say, justifications or are beliefs or are conceptions that are decided upon about those feelings, about those judgments. And that's sankhara. And that collectively contributes to and constitutes consciousness, which then has contact or pasa with form, and the cycle goes on and on and on and over again. Okay, so the claim that the sutra is making is that that whole process does not even continue momentarily. If I had to step into the shoes of the sutra and say, like, why are they saying something like that? What could possibly be meant specifically by this? I would have to say that it has to do with a very specific conception of how time works, which is that contact and sensation and mental formation, volition, all of these things occur instantaneously together. The way I've described it before in my own research and in other contexts is cognition-experience. So you're experiencing something, like the mind cognizes something, and together with that cognization is the reverberations of judgment, of memory making, of either kind of adding support to or taking support away from existing beliefs, that sort of thing, right? Buddhism challenges us to completely change that cycle for the better. Okay, in a very specific Yogacara kind of way, an early Mahayana kind of way, that whole process is instantaneous. It's presented that way in the Awakening of Faith and in the Vijnati Siddhi and in other very fundamental texts. So I have no reason to assume that thought process is absent from this sutra. It's so very instantaneous that when they say it doesn't continue momentarily, they say that each instant that a mind has contact with something is a new iteration of that contact. And the reason they say that is not because they have any hard evidence. They don't have any neutron microscopes or quantum computers to be able to really split the hairs that finely. The reason they say that is because they are justifying a claim that is, in every instant, you have the agency to make your cognition experience better than the instant before it. You have the agency to turn the base, they call it. They call it turning the base. Like, think of a giant column, like consciousness collectively made up of mental formations, volition, feeling, form, sensation. All of that composes a column, and you can point it towards good, bad, or neutral. And their argument is that it's all instantaneous, and you can turn that column from bad to neutral to good in any moment at all. Now, here's where we get into the Śrīmālādevī Sutra. I think that you would agree with this, they are misusing that conception of instantaneousness in this context. I actually believe the claim that Tathagatagarbha contributes to revulsion towards suffering and aspiration toward nirvana. I actually believe that claim. And when I say I believe that, what I refer to is I believe the fact that dukkha is cognizable even if you haven't encountered Buddhism, and that has been described for you, right? I think that you can understand that the world is simply not the sum of its parts. Like, that is applicable widely. And if you wanted to say that the reason why sentient beings can get that is Buddha nature, then that's fine. Say that. I'm not going to have any issue with it. But then when you come up and say that the reason why that's the case is because of that instantaneousness that's described in other texts, you completely lose me. Like, I have no idea why you're pulling that out. It doesn't make any sense to relate those two together. Saying that the 7 mental factors or the 7 mental phenomena don't continue even momentarily makes sense in the context of this specific concept of time and morality in early Buddhism. It does not relate at all to this claim about Tathagatagarbha. Here's another important point, too. This whole thing is a counterfactual about if there was no Tathagatagarbha, if that was like not a thing in the universe, in reality. If there was no Tathagatagarbha, then the base could not be turned, right? Their argument is that Tathagatagarbha is the very root of all morality. Therefore, in its absence, the base could not be turned. So how does, I don't know. I really don't get it. I'm not with Śrīmālādevī on this claim at all.
Yeah. At some point, there is a semantic argument to be made whether the aspect of myself that was able to get the start of impermanence and dukkha without being taught, it is possible to attribute that to Tathagatagarbha and just be like, hey, you didn't know you had this in you before. And there's no way to argue for or against that. It's a matter of, do you think that there is this Buddha nature under every sentient being that contributes to the good, the pure, the moral, or the insightful things that they think of or do or come to believe? And it's like, that is such a metaphysical idea that I don't see a use in making claims about that one way or the other. Like, did I come to this idea about this idea that eventually becomes the same concept as dukkha in Buddhism because of this underlying Buddha nature? Or did I come to this idea because I observed the world and critically analyzed it and came to my own conclusions regardless of whatever this unifying underlying factor is? And I don't see how the answer to that really changes much in how one behaves. And the ultimate thesis of this sutra seems to be to devote yourself, surrender yourself to this Tathagatagarbha. And I don't know if that's what you're wanting people to do. From my perspective, there needs to be a stronger argument going on than it's difficult to understand, you have to have faith.
Yeah, I'm with you there. You know, we've talked about how Buddhism is very universal in nature, in its implications, in its claims. It claims to be the way things are, regardless of if you have encountered Buddhism itself or not.
And I would also say that in many cases, that argument holds up. Impermanence is still impermanence regardless of whether you view it from the Buddhist perspective or just, oh, hey, everything eventually is destroyed or at least changes.
Exactly, yeah. And, you know, it's distinct in this way because it says that, like, if you do your own critical examination of things and come to these conclusions in the absence of encountering Buddhism, that is evidence for Buddhism. And that feels a little weird. Especially in this kind of post-Christian context that we exist in, right? Like, it feels a little weird to start claiming that things outside of the context of what your religion or belief system or thought process or habit of practice is suddenly now under its purview, or is suddenly now contributing to its truth, or is suddenly now evidence for it. That's a whole thing. So, as an additional kind of fun factoid here, I've been teasing the entire series that we've been reading, the Śrīmālādevī Sutra, that Turner Reeves, who came on our show to talk about Yogacara Buddhism many, many years ago, he told me at one point that he never believed in Tathagatagarbha. Like, he never bought it. He was like, this is just simply not a claim that I can follow. This is not something that I'm with you on. When he reads the texts, right? He read the Tathagatagarbha Sutra, he read the Diamond Sutra, he read the Lotus Sutra, he read all these sutras that have Tathagatagarbha in them. And he was like, no, I don't buy it. It's not making sense to me. But then he told me that he read the Śrīmālādevī Sutra, and that was the one that convinced him. Incidentally, you have landed on the line that convinced him. So this line that we have been spending the last several minutes poking holes in, quote, "Oh Lord, if there were no Tathagatagarbha, etc., etc." That's the line that convinced him. The line that we're struggling to buy into and that we're kind of picking apart right now is the one that made him really kind of vibe with Tathagatagarbha a lot more. Okay, and let me give some context as to why. I've been sitting on this for a very long time, and I'm excited to share it here.
Yeah, go for it.
One of the reasons that he told me why was because there is an equivalent argument in Catholicism, and he's Catholic. There's an equivalent argument, and that is that God must exist because if there were no God, then there would be no possibility and no proclivity for morality. And so it's the exact same kind of claim here. If there was no Tathagatagarbha, there would be no morality.
And I have heard that same kind of claim in my own contact with Christianity, and that is a claim that I've always bristled at. Because it gives me this impression that life cannot settle on good things without the assistance of a benevolent deity or force. And I don't buy that. We can land on what is good and what is evil through observing how life works, observing how our actions affect other people and how other people's actions affect us. I don't feel like I need a god or a Buddha nature to understand that hurting people is bad. And I find it, I don't know, hopeless in a way that I don't jive with to say otherwise. Like, we're not that helpless.
I agree completely. I think that the prevalence of claims like this doesn't speak to any sort of truth to those claims. It actually, to me, if I'm to psychologize it for a minute, it speaks to just a human tendency to universalize our own ways of thinking.
Yes.
We land on ways that work for us, and we just kind of decide, like, this must be how it is.
Or this must be how everyone else thinks.
Yeah, or how everything ought to be. And that's just not where I want to go. I'd rather just stay comfy and in my world of, like, the way I am works for me, and the way that I am is not the result of some kind of innate, universal, spiritual, religious truth or gnosis or what have you. It's actually just because it works.
And it's not going to work for everyone.
Exactly. And it should not be maximized to everyone on the earth, past, present, and future. It should not be maximized to the level of being projected onto this image of the divine that I myself have contrived as a means of justifying the way that I am.
Yeah. This paragraph that we've been poking at for all this time, it feels like the argument is either A, these moments don't matter because they're not even a moment, so I'll forget these ideas upon death and reincarnation, or those moments happen because of this inconceivable, unconditioned, eternal thing called Tathagatagarbha that, you know, we've just been talking about as the source for positive moral thinking and, like, goodness in the universe. That first version, where the moments don't matter, feels really nihilistic and really dismissive.
It's a little bit invalidating as well.
Yeah. Invalidating, hopeless, and, like, cynical in a way that feels unlike Buddhism. And then the latter idea, where these moments happen because of this Tathagatagarbha, that feels eternalistic and elitist. Because over and over in this text, it's saying the unconditioned is not something that regular minds can conceive of. So we're right back to the nihilism and eternalism both at the same time.
Which is what we were trying to back out of before.
And, like, at that point, it's just like, nope, table flip, I'm done, I'm out of here. And, like, that's when I had to walk away from this sutra for a bit.
Yeah, it's really presenting things in both a dualistic and a straw man kind of way. And it's also, it's not even just cynical and pessimistic, as much as it's even, like, just entirely dismissive of human experience in a way that I am not used to seeing in Buddhism.
So eventually I did come back to this chapter and continue reading, and got to another line that I really strongly disagreed with. So the line is, quote, "Defilements do not affect the mind. The mind does not affect defilements. then how does the mind, which is unaffected by nature, become defiled? End quote. What the hell are we talking about here? I'll accept the mind does not affect defilements. Like, thinking about something bad in a different way does not make it any less bad. But the defilements do affect the mind. That's the entire reason we're here, isn't it? If the defilements didn't affect the mind, then why do people act the way they do when they're in the grip of, greed, hatred, and delusion? I don't see how that is a statement one can make while observing the world around them. And the support for this argument in the text is only the Buddhas can comprehend this truth. That's so weak and dissatisfying and incorrect.
Yeah, this is a tough line. So I'll give some more context and ideas here. So greed, hatred, delusion, all of these unwholesome states, all of these poisons, all of these defilements, these are thought of in Buddhism. You could think of them as like clothes that the mind wears from time to time. They can be taken off and put on. You can wear them for a very long time. You can determine all of your behaviors based off of them. And if you do, you get really stuck into some bad cycles. You get stuck further, obviously, into samsara, and you continue to be reborn, according to Buddhism, in very bad contexts, and you cause others to be in bad contexts as well. But ultimately, they are thought of as clothes that the mind wears that are impermanent. The mind itself is thought of in this text to be marked by Buddha nature, and is thought of to be inherently and universally linked to the Dharma through this Buddha nature. And that linkage and that unchanging, unconditioned nature is that which is unaffected by defilements. And that's not really supported very well in the claim that's made in the text because, like Śrīmālādevī says, all she says is only the Buddhas can understand this. Again, I think it's both aggrandizing itself and the audience by saying, like, how superior you all are if you get what I've been saying for this entire sutra, which is Buddha nature. And it's also, again, just dismissive and doesn't make an attempt to say, well, actually, the reason for all of that is that the mind is independent of its states of being and blah, 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 like I just said. You don't actually need a super advanced, deep understanding of Buddhism to put together what I just did on air just now about this claim. Like, it's intelligible to a lot of people who have read these texts even cursorily. And so to kind of pretend like it's an esoteric truth is weird and stupid. And to not explain that the meaning here is not the mind as it's understood as behaviors or belief systems or thought processes. The mind is understood to be sentience. It's understood to be agency. It's understood to be Buddha nature. It's understood to be consciousness, right?
I would say that the only one of those on that list that wouldn't be affected is Buddha nature. Our consciousness is affected by the defilements.
Yeah.
This claim does not hold water at all.
Well, that's where it gets weird in the 5 skandhas or in the 6 vijnanas, where we've talked about before. We've talked about how, like, consciousness is thought of as like the collective of the 5 skandhas: form, sensation, perception, volition, etc. And we've talked about the 6 vijnanas as like eye perception, nose perception, tongue perception, skin perception, all of the 5 senses plus mind perception. And then consciousness is this secret, like, other thing. There's a lot of times where that claim is made, that consciousness is more than that sum of things. And it's not ever actually super clearly explained how that's possible. Like, what is the gap? What's the difference?
And I feel like the reason that doesn't get examined too much is because it starts looking like a self or a soul. Because that's what I'm hearing.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, and so, like, the Alayavijnana is an attempt at making sense of all that. And we translate that into English as, like, the storehouse mind, right? Buddhism kind of presents this as that which is affected and affects karma, like affect with an A. that is how karma has a mechanism to work in reincarnation, is with the existence of this Alayavijnana. And that's related back to that momentariness that we talked about earlier, that instantaneousness of the 7 mental phenomena. But anyways, the Alayavijnana, beyond just being this karmically affected thing, is not really described very much otherwise. And here it looks like what we're saying is the Alayavijnana is that which is unaffected by defilements. But again, that's mechanically untrue as it's presented in Buddhism, because the storehouse mind, the Alayavijnana, is absolutely thought of as the soil in which karmically affective things grow or don't grow. Like that which becomes karma is described as bijas, a bija in Sanskrit, which is a seed, and it's literally planted into the soil of the Alayavijnana, and then the behaviors, the thought processes that result from that, the experience that we have on a day-to-day basis in mind-only Buddhism is thought of as being the fruit of that seed. And then those fruits themselves will plant a seed, and then the cycle goes on and on like that. So yeah, it absolutely is affected. And what you have to do in mind-only Buddhism is actually root out all that is unwholesome and cease the process of seeding and fruiting. And that's how you achieve Buddhahood. This is just kind of acting like that's already happened. Like you could maybe put this into an enlightened frame of mind and kind of understand the claim in that context, but it just doesn't apply. It just doesn't make sense.
Anything else we should talk about in chapter 13? Since, we've only spent an hour on it.
I know, yeah. No, I'm good. I think that we're winding down.
Yeah, and speaking of winding down, most of my reaction is in chapter 13. As we move forward to chapter 14, at this point, I am no longer on the side of this sutra. It has completely failed to capture me. And so as it's talking, chapter 14, the true sons and daughters of the Tathagata. And what this comes down to is that the true sons and daughters of the Tathagata are the ones who accept Tathagatagarbha philosophy and do so with faith. That is where this chapter ultimately comes down on, is faith is the important part. And that's part of why I left Christianity. This mindset of believe it and you'll be okay frankly disgusts me.
Yeah, and I don't like, especially, and this could be a translation thing, but I have my suspicions that it is not just a translation thing. I have my serious issues with defining in-groups and out-groups. Like, I agree with what you're saying about the faith thing. Like, we've talked a lot about our holdups with the different kinds of faith that are described in Buddhism and in other religions. But what I'm also taking issue here with, that I don't see in other texts in Buddhism nearly as much or in the same way, is basically saying, these are the true Buddhists. Everybody else isn't, based on this one defining factor. Like, that's not a very Buddhist thing to do, is it?
That's extremely dualistic, for one.
Exactly. Like, it's not very nice and not very Buddhist to say, these people, they're the real ones. Everybody else is just, not it. Everybody else is missing the point, or otherwise they're being duplicitous or deceptive in some way. Like, no, I really don't like that claim.
I have never met a good person who talks in those terms. An actually good person.
Exactly, yeah. And if Buddhism is going to be as universal as we're talking about, if it's going to say, the fact that moral good exists in the universe is evidence of Buddha nature, we can't then turn around and say those people who believe in it are true people, true Buddhists, true whatevers, and others are not. Like that, that's not it for me.
Anything else to talk about in chapter 14?
Nope.
All right, and so then we come to the conclusion at chapter 15, and this is pretty standard wrap-up for a sutra. Everybody is awestruck by the wisdom of that they have just listened to a whole bunch of people get converted. The Buddha puts on a magnificent visual display. We've seen this before, and I don't feel a need to go in too much into the details. Although I do find it interesting that it wraps up by specifically naming the chapters of this sutra and kind of getting metatextual with the Buddha describing the text that you have just read within the text, within the dialogue. That's an interesting extra step.
Yeah, that's pretty rare. We don't actually get a lot of instances where the Buddha names his own chapters, where he names the structure of his text. Like, that's kind of a fascinating thing to see here. I mean, obviously, like, we can think of it as being historical and say, like, oh, the Buddha really did say that. And it's an interesting question to ask why. But I think also we have to acknowledge that people wrote this down, and that the people, for perhaps an equally interesting reason as perhaps the Buddha would do it, decided, like, hey, we're going to define the structure of this text in the text.
All right. Anything else we want to talk about in the text other than just wrapping up our thoughts on the text itself?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm all set to work our way out.
Yeah, so this one has been a roller coaster ride. At the start of it, we're both praising it. It's like, hey, this actually does a better job of elevating the position of women within the religion. It is talking about itself as being the best way, but it's doing so in a less insulting manner. And then towards the end of it, I crashed so hard through the floor of it. This one went places. And I'm glad I read it. It was a good experience, but I turned against it real bad towards the end, to a point where it's like, I don't like this one at all.
Yeah, this is a wild one. And that's kind of why it's been on the list for us to read, is like, it's got all of these very like nominally positive characteristics. I won't even say nominally. Like, there are positives to this text, like we've talked about. But then when you really get into it, it starts to trash the whole house. It starts to say 3 out of the 4 noble truths are wrong. And it starts to say, like, there's this in-group and out-group of people who believe in Buddha nature or don't. And it starts to say, like, there's all of these defining factors and characteristics that have these important ontological implications for cosmology, for sentient life, for people who practice Buddhism, like all these different things. Like, it's inimical, but it starts out in this not very conspicuous kind of way. And it presents itself, it frames itself in this not very conspicuous kind of way. But it's really tearing down a lot of stuff and really making a mess of things.
It's an interesting mess, but it's still a mess.
Very much so. Very much so.
All right. Well, I think I'm talked out.
Me as well. So that was part 3 of the Śrīmālādevī Siṃhanāda Sūtra. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening. See you next time.